All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Tonight we're going to talk about vineyard diseases for our VIDI 301 Bud Break to Harvest class. Of course, if you'd like to follow along, we have chapter 21 from our textbook, The Grape Grower's Handbook, which starts on page 253. Cool. So, vineyard diseases, why are they important? Well, it could affect your entire crop, your entire vineyard. If it gets so extreme, it could just decimate everything. If this is your business and your main source of income, of course, this is a huge problem, right? If you're just a hobbyist and you maybe just have one or two vines in the backyard, it might not be so detrimental. But nonetheless, it's very important to be able to identify disease and to work against it, right? So that way it doesn't spread and potentially harm other vineyards and other sites as well. So a vineyard disease is caused by a microscopic organism referred to as plant pathogens. So there's lots of different categories of these, and we have three main ones that we're going to focus on for this presentation, and that is fungi, bacteria, and viruses. So we're going to talk about those three today, and then it's very important also to note that the management practices for these diseases rely on anticipating the occurrence of the disease and attacking when the disease is most vulnerable along the points of its disease cycle. So just like in integrated pest management, we talk about understanding the reproductive phases of insects and other type of pests and knowing the seasons about which the vineyard is most vulnerable and it's the most favorable environment for that insect, right? It's also the same thought process for pathogens as well. There are certain environmental conditions where these things are, most happy and want to move in and potentially infect your vineyard. So those are the parts of the disease cycle that we need to know. It's also extremely important to note that you have to correctly diagnose what the disease is to effectively get rid of it, right? If you're trying to treat something that's a fungus when you think it's a virus, it's not going to be the same treatments. So that will be very important that you know exactly what you're working with. Cool. So for those of you that saw the integrated pest management presentation, this should look very similar for you guys. And it is the same concept, right? So how pests and diseases enter the vineyard is there three things need to come together very well. So the host needs to be present, which is the grapevine. The pathogen needs to be present, so the bacteria, virus, or the fungus. And then also a creation of the favorable environment. So the nutrients are present for that pathogen, then the pathogen is able to reproduce and spread across the vineyard, right? So that is when you see disease. So just because you have the host and the pathogen does not necessarily mean disease, and likewise host, environment. All three have to come together, and that's what creates a disease situation. Cool. So we're just going to go ahead and hop right into it. We're going to talk about the three different types of pathogens, the fungal, the virus, and the bacterial, and we'll just kind of go over some of the most common ones found across vineyards around the globe. This presentation doesn't spend a lot of time focusing on techniques to get rid of these things, but the textbook definitely does. So if you do not have access to that textbook, or if you'd like to see that information, I'd be more than happy to share that with you. The textbook is also available online. A lot of the information is just readily available on the internet. So we're just going to talk about the different types of pathogens and how they affect grapevines in this presentation. And then if you'd like to know how to treat that, we can get that information to you. But, yeah. Okay, so starting off with fungal pathogens. Fungi make up the largest group of pathogens, and they also come in a very wide variety, right? Fungi are also commonly known as molds. They are microscopic organisms that have bodies, known as mycelium, composed of multicellular, thread-like branched filaments called hyphae, and reproductive structures called spores. So this is just kind of a very simplified picture just for you to keep in mind, because there's a lot of very science words. If you don't come from like a biology background, it might be really confusing. So we have like the overall body of the fungus or the fungi. And then we see that we have mycelium, which is like a macro structure of that organism. And then hyphae are the microstructures that create the mycelium. So that's something important to know. And not that we're going to have mushrooms budding on our grapevines, but this is just a very basic overview of like the anatomy of what we're talking about here, right? It's also important to know that like you often see fungi as a result of dead or decaying matter, organic matter. So this is going to be extremely important for that ideal environment for fungal pathogens to exist. So a lot of preparation or prevention towards fungal pathogens is a lot of just like keeping your vineyard clean and a lot of just general like health maintenance that way. So if you have any decaying berries, fruit, leaves, anything like that, that will encourage the growth of fungal pathogens. So just keeping it hygienic is the most important thing you can do. Cool. So modes of transport for spores, right? So spores are how fungus is spread, right? We have wind, splashing water. They can also live in the soil and move vine to vine by growing around the roots, right? Those are the mycelium come in. And sometimes those are positive and sometimes those are negative, right? Humans and animals can also contribute to this. So just by walking through the vineyard, you yourself can spread diseases through the vines and also through your vineyard tools as well. So just your use of your boots or the use of your workwear that you're using, the clippers, tools, you can spread diseases to vineyards. So there are actually vineyards here in the Sierra foothills that are contaminated with certain diseases, and you have to change your boots before walking one vineyard to the next, or it's like prohibited to drive your vehicle through it. So that does exist, and that is very real to help prevent contamination of another vineyard. Cool. So we're just going to go through a couple examples of fungus derived diseases basically. So this is where we get into kind of some more deep information in this presentation. So one is black rot. Black rot is really common in eastern United States. Basically, it attacks all new growth of the vine. All of the Vitis vinifera species are highly susceptible to it. Some of the native, like American varieties, and then the hybrid varieties handle it well. That's why you see a lot of hybrid varieties on the East Coast, is because the climate is so different on the East Coast than it is on the West Coast, Western United States. So they have a lot more humidity, a lot more rainfall. The growing season's different, so they need to work with vines that can handle those conditions. So black rot is a very, very common thing over there. So the vegetative symptoms of this disease is tan, circular, irregular shaped spots on the leaf surface, oftentimes with dark colored borders. So we get a really nice picture of that here in the upper right corner. You can see tan spots with dark circles blotched around the leaves. You can also see black elongated lesions on the petioles and can cause the leaves to drop. And also large black elliptical lesions on infected shoots. Fruit symptoms: in the spring, you'll see tiny reddish brown spots surrounded by a yellow ring. Berries will eventually become hard and shriveled, and they call this mummies in the wine industry. So when they're like hard, dark, and shriveled, that is a mummy. It's really important that you remove these parts of a vine and it doesn't stick around through winter, because this is what we call a secondary inoculum. So the fungus will live inside these berries and on these leaves, and in the later part of the growing season, they are now the primary source in how the fungus overwinters. So if you just leave those berries on the vine, they'll overwinter, and then when weather starts to get better, they'll release more spores, and then it will just get continually worse and worse in your vineyard. So this is a good example of some of the disease cycles that are present depending on what pathogen you're working with. Cool. Next is botrytis, and we've talked about botrytis in these courses, maybe not specifically in this class, but botrytis is typically a fungus, and it is a disease in a vineyard, but some vineyards utilize it to produce special types of wines that are like sweeter and have some honeyed, beeswax characteristics. So it's actually utilized to create that in some occasions, but overall it is known as a fungus and overall a disease, right? So it's not going to make you sick. It's, kind of a similar concept like blue cheese, right? But in extreme situations, it's very damaging to your vineyard, and it can take over your entire harvest, right? The folks that use it intentionally to produce specific styles of wine are limiting how much rot is on the clusters, and are even going through by hand and clipping off some of the excess rot. So it's a very expensive, long process. So anyways, botrytis is a gray mold that attacks new growth, primarily floral parts or ripening fruit. The grape varieties that have tight clusters, so all the grapes are very packly tight together, like Chenin Blanc, Gewürztraminer, Pinot Noir, and Chardonnay, are very highly susceptible. So again, tight clusters, you're going to see more humidity, not a lot of airflow, so more likelihood of seeing a fungus growing on that, right? If you look at a Cabernet Sauvignon or Cabernet Franc cluster, they're typically a lot looser. They provide more airflow, so you're not going to have as much of a likelihood of seeing something like botrytis happen. It has to be a very, very extreme case where you see botrytis happen on those berries. Cool. So for vegetative symptoms, typically in early spring, you'll see tips of buds or shoots may turn brown and dry out. During humid weather, lesions covered in gray mold on the edges of the leaves and main veins often create a V shape, just like this. And then shoot stems can also be girdled. Extremities will wilt, die, and drop off. For fruit symptoms, these are the most common symptoms that I've seen working in the wine industry. You typically see it on the berries, and typically it starts on a wound. So it opens it up, and there's some sugar exposed, and that's when the botrytis really goes to work. And that wound could be caused by an insect, hail, or rain. It's very common for clusters to just receive some wounding sometimes. And the first signs may actually be small brown spots that you can actually just wipe off with your finger. But as it develops and as it grows, it'll become much worse. It'll start to look like this, where it looks like all this gray mold is just growing in here. Cool. So yeah, I think that's all I want to say about that one. So here is a good example of the disease cycle of botrytis. We have just a regular cluster that is either exposed to insect and or mechanical damage. So the berries are open and the sugar is exposed. Then it starts to rot. You have early season rot, and it goes into midsummer, late season rain or sprinkler irrigation. So now you are feeding that fungus water, so it has all the nutrients it needs, and it just proliferates all over this cluster. It continues to rot through the center here. Then you have pre-harvest rot of ripening fruit. So it's lots of sugar here, lots of rot forming. Then say the pickers decide not to take this off of the vine and just leave it. You have rotten bunches left on the vine. These will go into winter, and then they will produce mummified fruits. Then all of those spores will coalesce on that mummified fruit, and then in the springtime they will shoot out all those spores, and then you'll get shoot blight. So all of those spores that originated on rotting fruit come out and now attack the new growth that you have that following spring, right? So not a good time there. And then it just becomes more and more and more extreme of a case every year that's not taken care of. So that is a really good example of the disease cycle. So in a situation like this, if you are seeing parts of your area with lots of rot, it'd be very important that you go through and then remove all of that rot, remove it from your vineyard, so that way it doesn't overwinter and spread the following season. I also wanted to point out, I was just remembering that botrytis is super common. It's just everywhere. And if you have had that situation where you go to the store and you buy like a box of strawberries or something and you stuff it in the corner of your fridge, you forget about it, you pull it out and it's all fuzzy, that is botrytis. So botrytis is everywhere. Very common. Okay, another fungal infection is downy mildew. We have downy mildew and powdery mildew. If you're in the same parts, if you're in California like we are and you're watching this video, powdery mildew is the most common one for us. Downy mildew is a little bit different. It's very common in warm and humid areas of Europe and eastern United States. Again, Vitis vinifera are very susceptible to it, but native and hybrid grape varieties do pretty well. Infections are most common on the foliage, especially while young leaves are expanding. So vegetative symptoms would be yellowing spots on leaves in the beginning of spring. Later in the summer, it become more of an oil spot look, and it has been described as mosaic-like. So you can confirm that it's fuzzy mildew, or you can confirm that it's downy mildew by the fuzzy spots on the underside of leaves. It's never on the top side. So that's something very characteristic of downy mildew are the spots on the underside of the leaf. As opposed to powdery mildew, it just kind of covers everything in a coat as a powder, right? So we'll talk about that in a moment. For fruit symptoms, you'll have young fruit. Young fruit will become covered in a gray mildew, but the berries will then turn leathery, often appearing mottled gray-green for the white varieties or prematurely red for the red varieties. And so you have a nice picture of that here. It definitely looks leathery, does not look very appetizing. And if you were to harvest this fruit and make wine from it, it could have a moldy mildew taste to it and would not necessarily provide any positive characters for your wine in extreme concentrations, right? If this was just one cluster in 5 tons of perfect fruit, wouldn't really make a difference. But then also you have to talk about things like your SO2 management, how you're choosing to ferment the wine. Are you doing a native fermentation? There are other things to think about if you're going to work with this kind of fruit, but that's a discussion for the winemaking class. Okay, so now we talked about downy mildew. Now we have powdery mildew, and this is one of the most common things I see in the vineyards here in California, and it's all over. It's worldwide as well. So powdery mildew will form just with the seasons. You have a wet season, or if you have any bit of humidity in the air, you're gonna get powdery mildew. It's just you can guarantee it. So vegetative symptoms of powdery mildew are lesions. So lesions will begin as small grayish white patches on the upper surface that over time can coalesce and cover the entire leaf surface. It appears primarily on the leaf surface, but it can affect the bottom as well. It's important to know, though, that these are not forming in spots like downy mildew. So we have spots for downy mildew, and then for powdery mildew, it just mostly covers the entire surface, right? Especially the berries, too. Severely affected leaves can exhibit deformity, curling, and withering as well. For fruit symptoms, it's very unfortunate if you get powdery mildew, because if it affects your blossom clusters, it will actually drop those clusters and you just won't get a crop. If you have infected berries, it will develop web-like blemishes and eventually look ashy, just like this photo up here. If the epidermis, that layer of skin, is affected, the fruit will dry out and split, and this will cause a secondary bunch rot infection such as botrytis, sour rot, or other spoilage microorganisms. So this would be a situation where if you're seeing splitting and rotting, and you would even, if it was a sour rot, you'd be able to smell that in the vineyard. It would smell like vinegar. You would not want to use that fruit in your fermentation. Excuse me. At that point, it would just not be good to use at all. I would not recommend that. Okay, on to Eutypa dieback. This is very common. Eutypa is it's a disease that attacks woody tissue, basically, and it's very common in older vines where we see lots of cutting to retrain them, basically, right? So this is mainly a woody tissue destruction. It kills the vascular cambium in adjacent vascular tissues. This is very common in regions with high rainfall. I guess I would say El Dorado has generally high rainfall, and we do see Eutypa here. It's very important that you sanitize your pruners, your shears, before going from vineyard to vineyard if you have a vineyard that's infected with Eutypa, because that's one way it will spread, right? So vines of all ages are susceptible, but like I mentioned just a second ago, older vines with large pruning wounds are going to be the most susceptible. So when we see it the most is in situations like this. So a very big pruning wound. Here's a nice picture. You can see that this fungus has just attacked the inside of the vascular cambium and killed all these tissue cells. So it can no longer properly transfer water and nutrients from the roots up to the leaves, right? So it's choking out that plant, essentially. For vegetative symptoms, we see mostly dark marks on the wood under the bark. So you actually have to peel the bark back to see it. A cross-sectional of the piece of wood will make it a lot more obvious. You'll see it right away. For the leaf and shoot systems, typically you'll see that the leaves are generally smaller, they're cupped upwards, and they're chlorotic. So that's when they have chlorosis, right? So they're starting to yellow and degrade. Those chlorophyll, those green parts of the leaves are degrading, and it's giving it that yellow color, and it's very sick. So the symptoms will just become worse and worse each year until a whole part of the grapevine dies back. And this is just a really good picture up in this corner. You can see that this is, summertime, either probably early summer, late spring, and all these other vines are growing. They've grown out their canopy, but this guy right here has produced no shoots on this left arm. It's missing shoots here, and it's only producing right here. So most likely it has received Eutypa in parts of this vascular cambium, and there's only a small bit going here. Even with the small bit that's still present, it's much more stunted and behind in its development than the vines next to it. So what we would do in this situation is we might have to just cut off this entire vine and chop it right here at the scion. We might have to address how badly damaged the scion is. If it looks where most of the disease is taken over, like the core of that vascular cambium, we might actually take one of the healthy shoots from the vine next to it and train it over and let that work a little bit harder just to get those fruiting positions back. Or we might just plant a whole new vine here. It could be up to the grower. I've seen it done both ways. But one vine out of hundreds is not a big deal, but it is important that, people come through and they prune this. They're not pruning everything else around it because they could just be spreading that disease, right? So this is when you'd flag something, or you would inform your crew, hey, we're not, don't prune the vines with the flags on them, or if you do, make sure that you sanitize your shears properly and something like that. So Eutypa is not a good time. So here is an example of the disease cycle of Eutypa specifically. We have, where should we start on this? Let's start here. We have dead and infected wood, right? And again, these are things that are just airborne and just exist. And now once it's found a home, once it's found that environment, it will house itself and it will reproduce, right? So we have dead infected wood. Within that wood, we have fruiting bodies produced inside. Then the spores become discharged in the winter and spring during rainfall or snowmelt. And with that water, it's dispersed. Those spores go into a fresh healthy pruning wound, and then it will start to embed itself. Spores will germinate in the wood cells, and then it creates a canker. So here's a cross section of that canker, and then it goes all throughout again. And it will continue to grow. This is a cross section of that vine, how it looks, right? So it's gone within the canker, and now it's infecting the plant in through this wound, and it's taking over the vascular cambium, and it's just producing more and more spores every year. As it's affecting this vine, it's affecting potentially other wounds of other vines near it as well. So very common in the wine industry, but definitely something to look for. Again, good vineyard hygiene could help with this, but eventually you'll see it over time. But definitely want to manage it the best you can. Okay, so those are all examples of a fungus infection, right? Or fungal pathogen. So when it comes time for our quiz, I definitely want you guys to know the difference between the fungus, bacteria, and virus-based pathogens. So those are all fungus-based pathogens. Now we're on bacterial pathogens. So bacteria don't produce spores. They are just single-celled organisms, and they embed themselves into a vine to either a wound or something with nutrients, right? And then on the host, and then with the right environment, it reproduces through binary fission, right? So bacteria and yeast both do that, whereas a fungus will embed itself, create spores, and then send out those spores to go and infect other things. So kind of similar, but different process, right? So they're just like fungi, there are bacteria that are beneficial for the environment, and there are a handful that are negative for plants, right? So open wounds, natural openings in vines are a home for bacteria. Then it will reproduce itself, and like I mentioned, it does not produce spores like fungi. How it is spread is very similar. So wind-driven rain, driving or walking through a vineyard, wet from dew. It can be splash from the soil to leaves or leaf to leaf by overhead irrigation. And some are also spread by insects. So Pierce's disease is an example of this. So insects that like to suck sap out of the leaves of plants, they're like the mosquitoes of plants, I guess, would carry this bacterium, and then as they eat from plant to plant, they spread that bacteria. So that can become a huge issue as well. And that's why citrus trees are such a problem in California, because of the spread of Pierce's disease. But we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so next we have grape crown gall. And this is caused by Agrobacterium vitis. I did tag the bacteria or fungus scientific name to these slides. I won't ask you to memorize those, but you just so you know what it is, right? So Agrobacterium vitis, think about it as this is agriculture bacteria that specifically harms Vitis vinifera, right? So grape crown gall. It's actually a soil-borne bacteria, but it's only a threat if the grapevine trunk is injured. So grapevines that are grown in areas that are subjected to winter freezing temperatures are more likely to become infected because of the wounds created in the freezing. So for wounds being created in the freezing, my hypothesis on that is that, well, it could be mechanical, right, which is not winter related, right? It could just be that a tractor came in and accidentally got into it or something. But for freezing damage, if there is like an improper balance in like the water in the cells, water expands when it freezes, right? So it can actually create cracking on a cellular basis, and then create like micro wounds within the vine or the plant itself, right? So that's my hypothesis there. So grape crown gall can create severe economic losses within just a few years of planting, right? If it gets out of control. It's typically characterized through symptoms of rough galls or overgrowths on trunks, roots, and arms of grapevines. I see it a lot in trunks. Roots can also happen, but trunks are the most destructive because a grapevine can always just grow a new root, right? If one root gets damaged and it starts to create these galls, that's one thing. It can create new roots to segue around that. It's very difficult, if not impossible, for a grapevine to create a new scion, right? Unless you came through and you just took out this plant and replanted or, did something. The gall is going to be very destructive. It'll actually cut off, again, kind of like that Eutypa dieback. It'll cut off all of the water and nutrients. That's what we call girdling the vine, when it kind of chokes it out. And it will kill the vine completely. Sometimes the galls can be confused with callus tissue, which is what naturally forms when at a union after grafting. But the key thing to remember is that galls develop much faster, and they're typically cancerous in nature. And they also become soft tissue as they're decaying, so you can kind of poke it, and you can feel that too. But something like this that's quite large and bulbous is definitely not a callus. This is much larger, and this is a gall. And they call it a crown gall because some of the terminology about where the grapevine, the grafting union, sometimes they call it the crown. I guess that's the piece you put on top, I guess. So that's why it's called a grape crown gall. Fun little fact there. Okay. Next, for bacteria, Pierce's disease. So we're talking about how insects can be vectors for diseases. Pierce's disease is one of the most famous or infamous of those, and it's caused by a xylem-inhibiting bacterium, Xylella fastidiosa. And again, I'm not going to ask you to memorize that. That's just so you know. So what happens is it interferes with the flow in the vine, water flow, and then it places it under a lot of stress. So New Mexico, Arizona, California, we have a lot of problems with Pierce's disease, especially in portions of Southern California where there's a lot more citrus farms, and that's because these bugs love citrus trees. So that is a problem. These can be transmitted by both leaf hoppers and sharpshooters because they're sap feeders. So again, they have a needle-like mouth that will pierce through the epidermis of a leaf, and they will suck the sap out of the leaves, and that's how they spread this bacteria, basically. So here up top we have a leaf hopper, and then here we have a sharpshooter, and they're very similarly shaped, but different in size, and they come in different colors. And there's more than one type of sharpshooter that is a problem for vineyards and spreads this disease. So there's more about that in the textbook. Symptoms of Pierce's disease include yellowing and scorching of the leaves, and it will typically start on the outer edges and work its way in. Then eventually the leaves will fall off. The petioles will also die back and will look like a matchstick. So they call that matchstick petioles. That's one of the symptoms of Pierce's disease. For fruit symptoms, your flower clusters may set berries, but they'll tend to dry up, right? So that water flow inhibition will basically halt all growth on those parts. So not a good time. And with that being said, not all leaf hoppers are kind of like a pest in the vineyard, but they just exist naturally. There's just a lot of them. Yeah. Cool. And then, last but not least, viral pathogens. So a virus is very interesting. It's a tiny replicating pieces of genetic material that are covered in a protein coat. And how it works is it attaches itself to a host cell. It inserts its own genetic instructions, basically hijacks the host cell's functions to produce the components it needs to replicate itself. So basically, it's like a thief in the night that sneaks into a factory and then alters the factory settings to produce what it needs to thrive and survive, right? So just reproducing itself. So hijacking is one of the best words I could think to describe that, for sure. So the way that they can be spread, again, mechanically, workers' hands or tools, also through insect vectors like aphids, thrips, whitefly, leafhopper, mite, or even nematode feeding. And the nematodes are spread through the roots. And then also vegetative propagation. So this is why it's so important to buy grapevines and grafted vines from a nursery that's certified, because they will test and certify that these vines are not infected by a virus, bacteria, or any other pathogen. The hard thing is that once a vineyard is introduced to a virus, it is impossible to eradicate it from a vineyard. So that is not a good time. So some of these viruses, we have grape leaf roll. It's one of the major viruses that's affected all major grape growing regions of the world. It's transmitted by movement of material from propagated vines and insect vectors such as mealybugs and soft-bodied scale insects. For symptoms, you'll see the leaf roll, quite literally. So this is a white grape variety. You can see the leaves are pointy because they're just curled in underneath. A little bit of leaf rolling happening here too. There's also some color changes as well as a result. So for red varieties, you'll see what's called the Christmas tree effect, where they produce this very red color on the leaves, but the veins remain green, and that's something very important to remember. So green veins, but the rest of the leaf is turning red, so it's Christmas tree effect. For white grape varieties, the leaves will turn prematurely yellow, with the major veins also staying green. And another really important thing too is symptoms will start near the base of the vine and then work their way upwards. So get those basal leaves, the ones that are closest to the cordons or the head, depending on your training system. Those will typically show symptoms first. For fruit symptoms, we typically see a significant reduction in yield and then fewer and smaller bunches of fruit. And you might think, hey, that actually might be beneficial if we're trying to concentrate flavors. And yes, to an extent, but the virus will get worse and worse every year, and you will at some point have so little fruit that it's not worth paying for anymore at that point, right? Paying to produce it. Okay. Next, we have grapevine red blotch disease. This was not mentioned in the textbook, but this is a newer virus that a lot of UCs and other interested parties are studying, because we don't have a lot of information on this. We don't know how it's transmitted, and we don't know how to get rid of it. It's not known to kill grapevines that we're aware of, but it does negatively impact the fruit. So I'll just jump to fruit symptoms. So for the fruit symptoms, we typically see a reduction of sugar production, which is not ideal, right? Because we're not allowed to add sugar to our fermentations here in the United States, unlike parts of Europe. So with the reduction of sugar production, it's going to be really hard to ripen your fruit to levels that you're needing. Also, there's changes in pH and total acidity, but we don't really have consistent trends on that. We just know that it's variable, and it does have an impact. Some of the vegetative symptoms include blotches of color on leaves. For red varieties, we see the red blotching, hence the name, red blotch disease. And then for the white varieties, we typically see a pale yellow blotching. The one thing that is common, though, are the red veins. And I'm not sure if this is for the white varieties as well. It might just be for the red grape varieties. But the red veins are what really sets it apart from grape leaf roll. Also, you don't really see the leaf rolling on red blotch disease. So here's a really nice comparison for you guys. Red blotch versus leaf roll. And this is Cabernet Franc as an example. So here on the left side, we have a grapevine leaf. And it has flat margins, right? And then the one with leaf roll, it's curled backwards, right? So it's rolled downward. The red blotch vine on the left has pink or red veins, right? Whereas leaf roll, the veins remain green. So that would be the best way to determine which virus you have. Cool. And then, of course, we have UCIPM. We referred to this website for our integrated pest management presentation, but they also have great information on diseases as well. So if you would like to read more about, if you are working in a vineyard, or you have a vineyard in your backyard or something like that, if you would like to know what you have, I highly recommend UCIPM as a resource. They have information organized in multiple ways, which is very helpful. So if you know exactly what you have, you can go, boom, Pierce's disease or powdery mildew, whatever you have, you can go straight to that. Or you can go to seasonal information. So it'll be like early spring, what to look out for and when. It'll be like, okay, early spring, you're going to want to look out for powdery mildew, this, and this, and how to make a preventative work for your vineyard. They also have, like I said, general information on each disease, and then also disease management. And then we talked about how we manage pests. Very similar process with IPM. There's different levels of management for diseases as well. And of course, it's only useful if you've properly identified what disease you have in your vineyard. So highly recommend UCIPM. Great resource. All right. And that brings us to our learning objectives. I know there was a lot of information on each plant pathogen, but I would like you just to focus on, which ones are fungi, bacteria, or virus related. That will be very helpful on the quiz. Also to understand the vocabulary that was bolded and everything else that's listed here too. So lovely. Great. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. But otherwise, I will see you guys next time.